and a longtime member of Beth Shalom. And I would very much like to welcome him to our Peltzman class. And I hope you all enjoy our class today.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Shira. And thank you to all of you for waking up in this cold, blizzardy morning I hear that you're having in Kansas City. I'm coming to you from Los Angeles, where the sun is still kind of peeking through the clouds, and will be around 60 degrees today. So I'm thinking all of you, well, it's a little warmer here. Just a quick word of thanks to all of you for being here and for allowing me to speak at this Peltzman series. I remember when I was younger, always hearing about Peltzman, but never really being able to take part in it. So it's nice to be able to come back and be able to be here. At any point, if you have any questions, you're welcome to send them in the chat or ask them aloud. I just saw one question. I'm in my 4th of 5 years of rabbinical school. So 3 more semesters, and then I have to go find a job and start paying back the government for all its financial aid. Anyways, this morning we're going to do a couple of things, but the first and foremost is when I speak, I always like to give the opportunity for people to offer up a dedication. I like to dedicate my learning to different people, to different things. And so if you would like to share quickly who you'd like to dedicate your learning to this morning, you can either type it into the chat or say it aloud. I'm dedicating my learning this morning to the Kansas City Chiefs. As I think you would all be on board with that dedication, that they go to Tampa Bay safely, healthily, and that they are able to produce another victory and run it back to Kansas City. So my dedication this morning is to the Chiefs. And if you have a dedication, you're welcome to share it aloud, but you can also put it into the chat as well, and we'll raise those up this morning. So to those administering COVID vaccines, also to those who are receiving their COVID vaccines, I would add. If there's anybody else, you can keep it to yourself. I'll just take a moment for that. People's families, parents. We'll say anybody else who needs a little bit of love this morning, that we will dedicate our learning to them. So we begin by saying the blessing for learning Torah. If you know the words, you're welcome to say them with me. Otherwise, you can just respond amen at the end. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praise to you, God, King of the universe, who's given us the ability to go swimming into your sea of Torah. So as Amy mentioned, we're going to look at amnesia Torah. What does it mean to lose or forget the things that we learn? When I was growing up, my mother would always say, and for those of you who know my mother, this may not come as a surprise to you, that she would always say that she suffers from a disease called CRS. And CRS stands for can't remember. I'm not going to tell you the other word. Let's say stuff. Right? And it was always just a joke in our family until I got to the point in my schooling where I really was having trouble remembering that which I learned or that which I read just a short bit ago. And so it would come back to me in waves here and there, but the bulk of the things that I was learning, I would have trouble retaining. I was never good with pure regurgitation of material. Ask me to memorize this and spit it back to you, not going to happen. Ask me to take something that I learned and apply it and use it in a creative manner, no problem. So for me, I'm very much like a surgeon and a doctor. I see one, I do one, I teach one. I learn something, I understand it, and then I actually go and teach it. And then for me, it stays with me a lot easier than it would be if I were just learning it in class and never have anything to do with it. So we're going to all go through those experiences within our learning, in particular our Jewish learning, but we can really extend that to anything in the world, whether it's learning it through reading, hearing something, and wanting to return to it later on and not being able to. How do we access it and how do we share it with other people? And it's both a feeling of defeat and frustration. And it makes us feel as if the learning that we're doing is really for nothing and it's a waste of time. So if you've ever had the feeling that I never remember anything, whether it's your grocery list, the names of your children, if you're my parents, we always get mixed up, or anything else that you've ever learned, read, or experienced. Hopefully this will be a opening to you to understand that it is both a blessing and a curse, but it is more of a blessing. Everybody with me? Great. And again, at any point in time, once I'm sharing my screen or stopping sharing my screen, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I'm happy to go through anything. And if we don't get through all of the material, not a problem. I will tell you that I have a hard stop at the top of the hour because I have to go to school. So I'm with you all before I go to class. So with that, I'm going to share my screen with you all. And if you'll just give me a thumbs up or a verbal confirmation that you can see my screen. I see some thumbs, excuse me. Super. Okay, so I'm just going to get my chat visible so that I can see you all. And here we go. All right, we start at the beginning. With every classic Jewish learning, we always go back to the source, and that source is our Torah, right? We explore what might be something that's both positive and redemptive about the aspects of what it means to forget our stuff. So in our case, we go back to the Torah to see what we've learned and acquired. The verse in Dvarim, we're talking just before the receiving of the second set of 10 commandments. And if you remember, the book of Deuteronomy also has a second name of Mishneh Torah, the second repeating of the Torah. So everything we see in the book of Deuteronomy is a recap or reprisal of that which we've already seen throughout the first 3 other books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Remember, most of what happens in the book of Genesis is not law. There are a few things, but most of the story and the meat of who we are as a Jewish people and what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to do it stems from the middle 3 books. So here in verse 9 in chapter 4 of Deuteronomy, we're cautioned against forgetting anything that we've ever learned in Torah. The verse says, "Take utmost care and watch yourself scrupulously so that you don't forget the things that you saw with your own eyes and so that you don't fade from your mind as long as you live. And you should make them known to your children and to your children's children." We're given this really harsh statement that you shouldn't forget anything that you've ever learned. And more importantly, you should also then teach them to your children and to the future generations. This might sound familiar because this at the root is Passover in a nutshell, right? We have a Passover Seder where we gather to ask questions and we gather to teach them to our children. And that's the theme of the Passover Seder. We wouldn't be gathering, saying the 4 questions, eating that cardboardy bread unless you really like it. What if you do? All the more so to you, right? What we're seeing here is that the rabbis will then interpret, what does it mean to take care and remember the things that you've learned? So for all of you, who's talking here? Just at first glance, you're welcome to unmute yourself or you can type it into the chat.
God.
God's talking, right? God's telling Moses, be careful, right? Take heed to, if you are a KU basketball fan, take heed to all who enter, right? Take heed at what I'm about to tell you. Everything that you've seen, everything that you've heard, everything that you've witnessed over the course of the past number of years of both the wandering in the desert, but also your time in Egypt, right? It's important to remember those things and all the other lessons and explorations and experiences that you've had throughout your time in the desert. It's also really important to note that the generation that's listening to this final speech of Moses is not necessarily the generation that came out of Egypt. That generation has slowly died off. That generation is now the elder of the generation of the community, right? And now there's a new young force of people who are the ones who need to listen. And so if the people who came before them didn't tell them all the things that they needed to know and all the things that they needed to do, then they're immediately violating the statement that says that we should be scrupulous and not forget the things. And most importantly, as the end of the verse says, make them known to your children and to your children's children. Right? So it's immediately telling us that the verse provides a suggestion of how we're supposed to avoid forgetting in the future, and that is by telling the future generations. Any questions? Are we good? If anybody is a teacher in the room, I'm going to undo my screen so I can see all of you for a moment. If any of you is a teacher in the room or have ever taught, you'll know that one of the most important parts about teaching is not the teaching itself, but it is the learning, right? It is a circular process that we teach and we learn. And our Jewish tradition also puts an emphasis saying that we oftentimes learn more from our own students than we do from our own teaching experiences, right? And so part of that teaching is that learning, and who we are as teachers and how we transmit our information from one to the other, that accounts for over 2,000 years of our oral and written Jewish history. And so without it, we would have no idea what it is that took place 2,000 years ago. And by the way, this Shabbat, when we actually get the Torah itself at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai for Parshat Yitro, right? It's an actual second coming for us that we get to revisit what happened at the mountain with the fireworks and the pyrotechnics, as well as perhaps the slight coercion that it was that got God to give us the 10 Commandments in the Torah. Yes, I see a question from Anne. Yeah.
I find it, not a question, statement more.
That's
I
fine.
find it interesting that the two lines, which I, of course, don't remember reading,
Of course.
is, teach your children's and teach your children's children.
Uh-huh.
And though the Haggadah is nowhere in our Torah, isn't that interesting that that is the same message regarding Pesach?
Exactly. Well, remember, the Haggadah itself is much of a rabbinic construct than it is a biblical construct.
No, I understand that,
but as a result, what the Haggadah does is it grabs from these important verses, oftentimes from Exodus in particular, because that's what we're trying to retell as the Exodus from Egypt. But you're 100% correct that this teaching to your children, it's very much the theme of the Haggadah for sure. Yeah. Am I understanding you correctly?
Go on. It's fine.
You sure? Okay, so we're going to continue, and we're going to start looking through the sources from rabbinic literature. And when we look at rabbinic literature, we should always keep in mind two things. Number one, oftentimes they're writing for a very different audience than a Sarah Peltzman education series. Okay, so they're not necessarily talking to us directly. However, we can always extrapolate a couple things here and there that might speak to us and make it much more relevant, number one. And number two, when we look at rabbinic literature, it's important to remember that it is a gendered literature, that it oftentimes favors the male gender, but there's no reason why we can't insert any gender, man, woman, non-binary, whatever it is, that we can't insert those people, because the people are all God's creations. Okay, so that's just an important caveat when thinking about rabbinic literature, is yes, men, but there's no reason as to why women are not included into the mix. So our second source comes from Pirkei Avot, a collection of ethical and inspirational teachings from the rabbis from the period somewhere between the year 200 and 220 or so, codified by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. And in Pirkei Avot, they give us ways in which we can morally and relatably understand what it means to forget one item, right? So we're in a bind. We're naturally trying to remember the things that we learn, but we would be mortally liable, according to what the Torah says, if that we forget anything that we've learned. So if we move forward, the Mishnah says, what does it mean to remove your things from your heart? Rabbi Dostai ben Rabbi Yanai said in the name of Rabbi Meir. So a line of people talking that one person said in the name of the other person. Whoever forgets one word of his study, Scripture accounts the person as if they were mortally guilty. As it says in the verse, but take utmost care and watch yourself scrupulously so that you don't forget the things that you saw with your own eyes, which is our verse from Deuteronomy that we just said. Further says, and one could have inferred that this is the case even when studies prove too hard for them. Therefore, Scripture says that they do not fade from your mind as long as you live, which was the end of the same verse that we had in Deuteronomy. Thus, he is not mortally guilty unless he deliberately removes them from your heart. What we see here from this Mishnah is that they're very concerned with someone who spends time and actually decides that they're going to purposely forget the things that they learn. Now, I'm sure that there are times where you learn things that you want to just forget because you never will use them. For example, with myself, I'm never going to use the things that I learned in chemistry about chemical reactions as a rabbi. And while it might be important to know how biology works for the way in which human beings are created and talking about end of life or pre-life, they're not the things that I'm using on a regular basis. And we all have those things in our life that we were taught, that we heard, that our parents told us, that we don't come back to anymore. And if I asked you what those were, you could probably pinpoint them very easily. I saw a few people nodding as like they understand where I'm coming from, right? And how many people have went to college or went to study something that after they finished studying it, they didn't really use it, right? How many people go to law school and then end up becoming social workers or doing other things instead of law school? That's a really good example. I have too many friends who go to law school and then don't use it. Why waste the time, the money, and the energy? I don't know, but to each their own. So according to this Mishnah, there are two ways to read the idea of deliberately forgetting one's own learning. Number one is the passive way. When one says, in order to return to this learning, I need to go over it and ascertain it a certain number of times, but I don't really care enough about my learning to put forth that effort. So I'll forget it and I'll just continue, and it will be a sacrifice through learning of some sort of, it'll be lethargic. It'll be some sort of apathetic approach to learning. And deciding that learning is not really worth it and worth committing to memory is a really much a way of thinking about things that certain people do depending on the subject matter. But number two, another way of looking at it is what you might be thinking that it means to sit and to remove it from your heart, is that you're deciding that you don't want to agree with what it is that you're learning. No more. You actually put the effort into the discipline that comes from the learning of your own Torah in your mind, to the learning that you can cater for something else. So if I don't want to learn quantum physics, I'm just not going to learn quantum physics, but I could gain something else in return. And perhaps what the Mishnah is trying to say to us, it's trying to suggest that what it means to deliberately forget your Torah is to understand that there is a deliberate and thorough way of going through what might be a dangerous things that we learn from our parents. There are things that we learn from life experience that if we don't keep with us, they can have violent and awful consequences. If any of you are doctors, you might think about some of the times where you learned a procedure or you learned a diagnosis or you learned something that was solely for that one individual unique case, and it'll never come up again. But if you forget it, you could potentially harm lives in not remembering and helping somebody else remember that particular thing, right? So the more neutral forgetting, the more natural forgetting. Does that make sense? The more that we kind of are neutral towards our learning and towards the things that are coming in and out of our brains, the more natural that we'll probably forget something. And when it's natural, there's likely no warnings, and then it just completely slips away from us. And that's a big challenge. And I'll tell you transparently, as someone who's studying to be a rabbi, who sits day in and day out looking at text, looking at theologies, looking at different ways in which our tradition and our texts say things, I am at information overload, right? I sit for way too many hours at my desk during the day with 3 computer screens. You can't see, I have 2 to my sides, right? And you can see my library behind me of constantly books on my table. I had to clean off my table this morning so I could get to my computer, right? There's information overload. And while I want to be able to use and so, right, and what our rabbis tell us. Torah. So in order for us to exist stories and back and forth dialogue between the rabbis, telling us how it is that we're supposed to do certain things, how it is that we're supposed to do the Passover Seder, how it is that we're supposed to say the Shema every day. So we're going to look at 3 pieces from the Talmud itself. one from the tractate of Brachot, which deals with blessings, one from the tractate of Eruvin, which deals with separations and borders and boundaries, and one from Menachot, which deals with sacrifice. Any questions so far? Everybody's on board here? I promise it gets a little more tasteful with the conversations from the Talmud, where they really kind of draw out for us how it is that we learn. One more note about the Talmud. The Talmud itself, the way in which it was compiled, was pure memorization and regurgitation. As we saw in the Mishnah, which is the base for the Talmud, it said in the name of this person, said in the name of that person, that this person said. They never wrote these things down. There was a scribe at one point in time who eventually came, they're called the Meturgaman, they're the translators, what they're called, and they were responsible for taking the things that they would hear and that people would say and trying to piece them together and eventually write them out. And they eventually wrote them out in what's called the full Talmud, right, as we know it. And there's important to note that sometimes they got things wrong. And there's what's called a different addition or a different way of thinking, an alternative version. It's called the Girsa. And what that Girsa, or that alternative version, tries to tell us is that while it could have been this way, there's also a possibility that they might have said it that way, right? So for example, let's say if we take a basic arithmetic, that one person said that 2 + 1 = 3. Equals 3. And we all know that simple math problem, but the way in which we get from 2 to 3 versus 1 to 3 is important because there's a different school of thought. Another example is when we have different houses of opinions. The most common and most popular might be Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Has everybody heard of those two characters and those two schools of thought? Different ways of thinking that the rabbis codify and put together, and then we get a larger series of texts called the body of the Talmud. Okay. In the opening pages of the tractate of Brachot, which is the very, very first tractate of the Talmud, they're moving from a conversation about the first shift of the priests during the times of the temple, because they were broken down into 3 different watch periods, and they've just finished a large discussion about how to say the Shema, right? That prayer that we say both in the evening and the morning. And the Talmud says the following: Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi further advised. He said that we should be careful to continue to respect an elder who's forgotten the Torah knowledge due to circumstances beyond control. We might modernly understand that as something out of one's control is a disease, right? They have dementia, they have Alzheimer's, they suffer from some sort of mental illness that doesn't allow for them, mental meaning the brain, illness that doesn't allow for them to remember the things in which they've learned and be able to then pass it on to the future generations as we learned from the Torah. So even though they're no longer a Torah scholar, we still must respect their Torah that they possess. That deep down inside in their heart and their mind, they still have all these things that they've spent hours and days learning, and that we have to respect them. As we say, both the tablets of the covenant and the broken tablets are placed in the Ark of the Covenant in the temple. And even though the first tablets were broken, their sanctity obligates one not to treat them with contempt. An elder who forgets the Torah knowledge he possessed is likened to the broken tablets. I love, love, love this image, right? It speaks about the elder or the sage who's forgotten their Torah. And it says that perhaps it was because of duress and their old age, they're no longer to share and have the same kind of mental capabilities that they once did, right? Their mental prowess, their Talmudic prowess that they once had before, right? Something comes into their way, is a stumbling block, and prohibits them and prevents them from sharing forth that Torah. And so it's as if they've forgotten it themselves. So how do I know that I need to be careful and show respect to the elder, besides the fact that our Torah tells us that we're supposed to honor our parents? And I would extend that our parents is really, we should honor the elder, right? And we should honor those people who come before us, right? Because it says that the tablets were placed in the Aron, into the Ark of the Covenant, not the one from Indiana Jones, but the one that we. So what image is this doing? Right? What are the rabbis trying to tell us? Anybody? what's the comparison being made?
That our elders are sacred.
That our elders are sacred. Sure, Susan. Yeah. And then what do we do with something that is sacred?
We hold it in high esteem.
Right. So can you give me a more modern example within our Jewish tradition of something that, Susan, doesn't have to be you, but something that is sacred that we either elevate or do something special with?
We keep it safe.
What is it that we keep safe?
Well,
We guard it.
the Torah. I mean, yeah.
Right. We put the Torah in a special box, case, ark,
Yeah.
cabinet, whatever. So too with our elders, and we need to protect them. Right. What the Talmud is trying to say is that the elder is one who once embodied Torah, and it is analogous to the two tablets, the first two set of tablets that Moses got at Mount Sinai that he eventually broke when he saw the golden calf. And that even though he broke them, and even though the reason he broke them was because of a violation of the mere 10 commandments that Moses was up on Mount Sinai getting from God and brought down, we still kept them safe. And we put them, the shards, the ashes, the pieces of those tablets, we kept with us, and we put them in the Ark of the Covenant, and we took them wherever we went. So too with the elder. When the older person loses their Torah, we still broken tablets, and they are elevated the status of tablets because the tablets themselves, even though they're broken, they still contain the Torah. They still contain the laws. And so through this, we can understand that the old person, or one person, I'm going to say, not doesn't have to be old, but a person who loses the Torah is still as if they are the broken vessels and still have this incredibly elevated and sacred status amongst the people. And that's amazing. Right? People who suffer from Alzheimer's, dementia, or any other disease or illness, even CRS, as my mother would call it, who can't remember things, it's not as if they've lost them. It's that they've now been given this prohibition that they can't share the things that they've learned, but they haven't actually forgotten them. So too with the tablets is what the Talmud is analogizing, that just because the tablets are broken doesn't mean that we can't learn from them, and doesn't mean that they're no longer holy. So though we can't teach and learn the older person, right? Though they can't teach and learn like they once did, they still have value and they need to be respected. And tablets in the Ark, which was a holy site and a conduit for the Torah itself, which I think is an incredibly fascinating image to always remember that even if we can't do, we still very much possess things that are important and that people can learn from. Any questions? Thoughts? Anybody disagree with the analogy that broken vessels no longer have what to teach us?
You know, excuse me.
You're good.
I hear what you're saying. And I think the generation that came before us has so much to offer to young people. I mean, this is a very hard lesson to hear right now during the pandemic for me.
Sure.
And how the older people are being held safe in terms of where they might be living. And it's really very difficult for me to hear this right now, because I don't know that our country's doing a really good job with this.
Sure. Thank you for sharing that. I would agree. I see that in the congregants that I work with who are homebound, who haven't left their home since March, and who haven't had visitors, and who struggle and who can't hug their children and their grandchildren and can't be around them. My parents who desperately would love to spend time with their children and grandchildren. Yeah, Susan, you're right. It's really hard. But however, I will say that with modern day technologies, it is significantly easier to have the contact that once wasn't as able, is easily able to do. So there are some silver linings to that really challenging feeling, right?
I understand that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just an interesting lesson to have at this particular time.
Yeah, it's hard. You're right. No disagreeing there at all. Thank you for sharing that. Any other comments? Any other feelings? Carol, you have to unmute yourself. Yeah. There you go.
Okay. My mother had Alzheimer's, and all the way to, well, she never was in the hospital. But when she lost things like me, gradually a person with Alzheimer's, I think until the day she died, she knew I was hers, but she didn't know who I was. And luckily, some people might not agree with this, but luckily she died before the systems all start falling apart and all that. But I guess what you're saying makes me feel good.
Okay.
In that inside of her somewhere, she did retain it. I just couldn't get it from her.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of how I'm looking at it. But I when they're really, really not communicating or anything at all, it's very hard to hang on to the fact that she really does remember me.
Sure.
She just can't express it.
Understand. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Okay.
I think there, in my experiences, I was a hospital chaplain. I worked at Research Medical Center for a summer a couple of years ago. And I remember dealing with patients of all shapes, sizes, and varieties of illnesses and things and reasons for being there. And I remember on numerous occasions learning from my fellow chaplains, as well as from some very veteran doctors. Not all new doctors have this experience to be able to say yet, that when you're in a situation where someone is losing their memory or someone is not able to communicate, they haven't lost their ability to listen. And it was really important to be able to just continue to speak to those people who might have been in comas, people who were sleeping, people who were on ventilators and not able to speak for themselves. That doesn't mean that they've lost their listening abilities. And so the lesson that I learned there was that we can still learn from the silence and we can still be present in that. And that is a learning experience for some. For others, it's incredibly frustrating, and that I totally understand and validate. Carol, what you're saying is totally true. Yes. So thank you to you and to Susan for sharing. Any other comments? Any other thoughts? It's also, I think it's important to remember that when the rabbis of the Talmud and throughout rabbinic literature wrote, they had no idea the things that we know now, right? Someone who wasn't able to speak back then was considered to be the bottom of the litter, and they had a word for them, and they were dumb, right? Not necessarily dumb in that they can't speak, but they were completely useless to society. People who can't speak now can still very, very much contribute to society. And so the way in which the rabbis thought then, we as educators, we as modern day Jews have to understand that it is a completely different time period that we're living in. And with modernization of medicine and technology and communications, and we have to kind of insert ourselves into the text then to say, what is it that they're really trying to say and how can I apply it today? And I think that's always something that I struggle with at times when reading Jewish text is, there's no way that the rabbis would have actually been able to survive a global pandemic like we're in right now. Right? There's no way that they would have been able to survive civil war and racism and bigotry and all of those things that we are dealing with on a daily basis. Then they were so insulated and so closed off from everything else that I really don't believe that they would have been able to be successful and thrive during those times of settings. So I think it's important for us to remember that when we live now, we have to take our modern day life and knowledges and take them with us when learning something that's very ancient. I just think that's a general statement. Okay, we're going to move forward. Right, takes the images and pushes them a little farther. Not only all the broken tablets symbolic of someone who's perhaps forgotten their learning, but it also about where we keep them. So Rabbi Eliezer said, what is the meaning of that which is written? And the tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God, engraved upon the tablets, which we'll read in a few weeks when we read about the golden calf. This teaches that the first tablets, the subject of the verse, not broken, the Torah would never have been forgotten from the Jewish people, as the Torah would have been engraved upon their hearts. Right? We have a very unique and powerful claim here, that the breaking of the two tablets is enabling the forgetting of Torah. And at the same time, we understand that there is something that's still valuable about someone who is as if they are broken tablets. That comparison. Someone who's forgotten their Torah. And in order for us to understand what it means to forget Torah and what it means to do so in a natural way, even pushing that, there's perhaps a deliberate and destructive manner that's happening here, right? If it wasn't for the fact that the tablets were broken, we would never have been able to forget. The Torah would never have been forgotten from the Jewish people, right? Perhaps the breaking of the tablets was a necessary requirement for us to be able to be who we are, for us to be able to learn. I'm going to skip this longer story, and I want to take us to a later source. There's a Midrash. And I think, have you all learned a little bit of Midrash over the years before? A little bit? So I like to say that Midrash is the filling in the gaps of the text itself. For example, one of the most famous Midrashim is that of who Abraham was and why he was chosen. Right? All we know about Abraham from the end of the portion of Noah after the flood, when they do the genealogy, is that Abraham was the father of Terach, who had a brother Nahor and Haran. That's all we know. All we know about Abraham. And then all of a sudden, at the beginning of chapter, I think it's chapter 12 or 13, when we start the book of the parsha of Lech Lecha, of Get Up and Go, God says, Vayomer Adonai el Avram, Lech Lecha. God says to Abram at the time, get up and go. Leave your house, leave your father's house, leave the country, leave the comforts and the confines of your own home, and get up and go to where I'm going to tell you. And the rabbis say, okay, but who this guy? Who is this person? And the Torah doesn't tell us. And so what the rabbis do is they use the power of Midrash, which is creative license of expression. And they tell us that Abraham was an honorable and humble and faithful individual. Why? Because once upon a time, Abraham had a father who owned an idol shop. And when his father went out of town, so on and so forth, idols were smashed. Abraham showed faith, so on and so forth. We all know that story. One of the most famous Midrashim that there is. Another famous Midrash is about the, and no one wanted to be the first person to go into the water. A man named Nachshon jumped into the water. It came up to his nose. The water split in half. And that's how the Jewish people went into the sea. Please don't tell Rabbi Glickman that I just mentioned Nachshon. He'll be very, very upset with me. Okay? Our secret. Great. It's because it's very cited and it's very overused and people don't always use it properly. But you get the idea of what the Midrashim are. So this Midrash is a way of comforting. It's a comforting Midrash about how bad I might feel when I forget something. And it relates to me very, very much. And I'd like to share it with you. And we're going to read just the third paragraph of this Midrash. And also, I'm going to send all this to Shira and to Amy to send out to all of you in case you'd like to look at it on your own afterwards. So Midrash Rabbah is a compilation of what we call Agadah, of stories that come to fill in the gaps of the different books of the Torah. We also have Midrash Halacha, which is Midrash of Jewish law, which explains the law pieces, but this is a story piece. The final paragraph here. Rabbi Levi said that it is like a basket, and we're talking about the analogy here, that this is analogous to a loaf of bread hanging in the height of the house. Okay? It's a weird analogy, but go with it for one moment. Rabbi Levi said that it is like a basket with holes whose owners hired for workers to fill it, right? You're trying to fill a basket that has holes in it. It's very much an activity we would have tried to do in USY to just prove that you can't always do the things that you want to do, and you have to be creative about how to do them. Thanks, Steph. The dull one said, meaning the person who's not so smart, says, what am I gaining by doing this? It goes in the opening and it comes out. Like, I recognize that this is silly. I recognize that what I'm doing serves zero purpose. And I recognize that I will never be able to fill the basket because there are holes in it. Okay. So what has the alert one said? The person who's a little bit more with it, a little more attuned to things, perhaps you would call them the wise child of the Passover story. Don't I get a reward for each jug? He's like, I'm going to find a way to do this, but what is it for me? What's in it for me if I do this? The dull one says, what have I gained in learning Torah and forgetting it? Right? That's a real question. I wouldn't call that person dull. That's actually pretty smart. That's pretty intelligent to say, what do I gain in learning Torah that I forget? And the alert one says, doesn't God pay for effort? Doesn't God pay for effort? What is that phrase? Doesn't God pay for effort? Any ideas as what that means? Last time I checked, I didn't get a stimulus check from God. I barely got one from the federal government because I thought it got stolen, but thankfully I found it. But like, what does it mean, doesn't God pay for effort?
Well, doesn't God reward you during your lifetime for the effort that you put into anything that you do with the right purpose in your heart?
Well, Jill, God rewards you because you have continued to be present with me in my life for so many years. So that is a reward unto itself. So thank you, right? And the Torah that you've taught so many people over the years is innumerable, and it's amazing. So thank you for being my teacher. And for that, I agree. Yeah, totally, for sure. Carol, I saw your hand as well.
I just remember in teaching children, whatever the concept was, I always applauded their effort. If they did put in effort and couldn't get it, then as a teacher, it meant I needed to break that concept down and teach it, I guess, in a different field. Something, you may not get the thing you want, but somewhere along the line, you're also learning that everything you put into it is still important.
Amazing. Thank you. Yeah. I love that I'm in a room of, one second, Bev and Susan. I love that I'm in a room of former teachers and educators and community leaders, some of which I've known my entire life. I see the Shores here who sat behind or in front of us. I never remember it at 95th. And, you know, it's lovely to see people who can speak openly about their experiences. And that's great. So thank you for that. So Bev and then Susan.
I was going to say that teacher, you and a school librarian, for example, if you work with when I used to work with kids and we were just starting to automate the libraries, and if you could teach a child how to search through the online catalog, when you get satisfaction, and that's your reward.
It's funny that you said that, and then Susan, you can speak. When I was at the Hebrew Academy, and Fran Wolf taught us how to do the Dewey Decimal System, I never, ever, and some of you can totally relate to this, I never thought that I would care to know and learn and use the Dewey Decimal System. However, more times than none, believe it or not, in rabbinical school, when going to the library looking for whatever I was looking for, I think of Fran Wolf every time I was looking at the Dewey Decimal System.
Next time I talk to Fran, I'll tell her what you said.
Please. And I also also, learned how to appreciate a good story and storytelling, because that was part of library for us, especially in our younger years of the academy. As we got older, it was more like how to use the Dewey Decimal System, how to use research databases, how to use the copy machine, how to not use the copy machine. Because copy machines are meant for copies and not for school personal printing. Anyways, Susan.
I guess what this teaching brought to me,
Mm-hmm.
and what it reminded me is, throughout the years, different people with whom I've studied,
Mm-hmm.
and different rabbis
Sure.
I've met, have always taught, if you can't get 100% behind doing practice, try it a little bit. If you've never, and at camp, that seemed to be a recurring
Sure.
theme. When I attended, when I was a counselor, et cetera, when the kids went, that was a recurring theme. If you've tried, Judaism has all different kinds of practices attached to it, and things you can do,
Mm-hmm.
depending on your discipline, from Reform to Orthodox. But try doing a little bit and see if that makes a difference in your life. And if it does, then it's right for you.
Amazing. So I just want to go back to the text for 1 second. If you'll notice in the text when I read it, there were multiple types of people who were speaking, right? We have the dull one, the alert one, and we have the dull and alert ones. Okay, and I think it's really important to raise up that that any type of person is a different type of learner. And so they may be dull as a category and as a identification marker, right? But that's modern day, different types of learning abilities, right? We have people who are auditory learners. We have people who are visual. We have people who are kinesthetic learners. Every type of learner that there is will come across a situation or a particular thing in a different way that will allow them or prohibit them and prevent them from processing what it is that you're doing, right? But what I also love about this Midrash is that it says, don't worry about your Torah learning and forgetting it, right? Why? Because God pays you no matter what, because Torah learning and education in general is very much a mitzvah. And you get a reward for doing it, even if you forget it, even if you can't remember it, even if you don't care about it. If you're doing it, if you're engaged in it, right? God is providing reward for your efforts. So Torah learning is, when we absorb it, great. When we learn it, great. But remember, we're doing it because it's important to do and because we're being repaid from a higher level. And I think that's amazing. It's like an automatic A+, or when I was in elementary school, it wasn't letter grades. It was like S for satisfactory and like A for amazing. And I probably always got B for like bleh. I don't know. I wasn't the student my brothers are, and I recognize that. But I want to take it to one other level and perhaps give it a more modern day approach to all of you. If you remember the movie, I believe it was in the early 90s, The Karate Kid, with Mr. Miyagi and Daniel-san. Think about this. In the movie, Mr. Miyagi trains the student Daniel, right, by telling him to paint a fence, by washing and waxing the car, and he does it in a certain way. And Daniel thinks that, what's the connection between wax on and wax off, between painting and karate? When am I going to use painting a fence and waxing a car in karate? By the way, I asked the same thing about when am I going to use biology and other things and other life skills that I have in the rabbinate. I'll let you know if I ever get there. And so as he does so, Daniel thinks that this is a mental task, that it's meaningless, it's busy work. It's like Mr. Miyagi doesn't want to wash his car, so he's not going to wash his car, so I'm going to do it for him. No. It turns out that he's training the muscle memory, and he's training his hands and his muscles to be able to go like this, right? Which is incredibly important for someone who is a karate master, right? So to be able, and you're focusing in on what it is that you need to be doing, right? And it's a really powerful thing. And the owner of the jug tells us to fill it and empty it and repeat this motion. Why? Because we're learning something. And it's not Torah that we're learning is necessarily like in the beginning, God said, let there be light. No, we're learning Torah of life. And I think that's really important to remember, that Torah has so many different meanings, right? And we're watching those learning opportunities slip away from us because all we want to do is just get things done or not do them at all. So when we're saying here that doesn't God pay for the effort, that no matter what, there's value in learning and in forgetting. It's another reason, it's a reminder to me that I really do struggle to remember things. I will show you, I have just at my desk, I have three notebooks that I write everything down in, right? If I come across a quote in a book that I like, if I need to, I'm doing a wedding in a couple of months. So when I meet with my couple to do conversation with them for premarital counseling, whatever it is, if I do a funeral, I write everything down. Not because I want to come back to it in 10, 15 years from now and look at all the things that I've done, but because if I don't write it down, if I don't do it, I'm not putting forth my effort. And I recognize that for me putting forth my effort is not filling a basket without holes or waxing a car, but my effort is putting forth is writing it down and trying my absolute best to be able to remember it. So expressing ourselves to Torah, we have to express ourselves to more Torah and expose ourselves to more Torah, because then it strengthens our muscles and our ability to learn. And if you lose that Torah that you learned, yeah, it's frustrating, but it's okay. So what this Midrash is trying to tell us is that learning Torah is about transforming you as a person. It's moving your muscles. It's strengthening your muscles. It's going to the gym. But it happens to be that the gym is in an educational setting and you're not going to sweat as much, right? And it's not about being someone who knows a lot. The brainiac is not what it's about, right? It's not about your IQ. I think it's more about your emotional sense, that you're able to process and know that if you put forth that effort, you're going to get something in return. And so I want to end with one final midrash, which I first learned from Dr. Ron Wolfson. If any of you know Ron Wolfson, master Jewish educator, Ron is known for his ideas about relational Judaism, how to make Judaism more meaningful for you, and how to be more opening and welcoming. And if you can bring Ron at Steph, if you can bring Ron at any time, he's a good old boy from EMSA Region USY from Omaha, Nebraska. And I first learned this story with him. And while the story is on the paper, the page in front of you, I'm going to share the story from heart because it's one that really just means a lot to me. It says that when the baby is in the mother's womb, when the fetus is in the womb, that the baby learns all the Torah, all of the things that it possibly could ever need to learn or want to learn, and that there is to learn, right? And at the moment that the baby is ready to depart the mother's womb and enter into the world, which, by the way, that transformation is incredibly powerful, but we can talk about that another time. So as the baby is ready to enter into the world and exit the womb, all the Torah, all the learning, all the street sense, the common sense, the book smarts, everything that there is to learn that is with the baby is immediate loss, because the angel comes and slaps the baby in the spot between your nose and the top of your lip, which is called the Philtrum. As you can see here, the vertical groove between the base of your nose and the border of your lip. It's called the Philtrum. And as the baby is smacked on the lips right here by the angel, it causes the baby to forget everything that they've learned. As the verse says, sin crouches at the opening. Now, I love this story for multiple reasons. Number one, I taught this in the place that Talmud study, the Daf Yomi, the daily study of Talmud, was invented in Poland one summer when I was staffing USY pilgrimage. So I taught this piece, and because it was the actual day, and to be able to say that you all have the ability to continue learning, you have the ability to continue teaching, was really powerful. So what can we learn from Rabbi Simlai, which is what I love? Number one, nothing more natural than knowing Torah and forgetting Torah. There is nothing more natural than learning something and then forgetting it. And it is natural and it is totally fine. Number two, there's something valuable in knowing and forgetting. That you recognize, I once knew this and I forgot it, and I'm going to learn it again. And maybe it'll come to me when someone says a key word or a phrase or asks me a question, and it'll come to me and I'll be able to bring it back. Number three, there's something crucial to growth in both learning and forgetting, whether Torah or anything else in life. We can grow from learning and forgetting. And it may be that forgetting the Torah is what the baby needs to flourish and thrive in the world, because it is our job as parents, God willing one day, but as adults, to teach our future generations and to learn from them, right? And that change and that growth is possible in the world. And that's what we're telling that baby. But I think when we teach Torah and we think about it in general, the things that we've learned and the things that we've forgotten, we should be happy. We should feel privileged. We should feel proud. But most importantly, when we think about all the Torah that we may have forgotten, and we think about all the lessons that we've learned, the ways of our growth and our change and becoming better people through that absorbing of the things that we've learned in that Torah and what it comes to teach us, that it's not merely remembering the verses and the text itself is what's important. It's the ability to be present in that, and to have the opportunity to take a moment to think about the things that we have, that we've learned, that we've taught, forgotten, and take that with us, because we are constantly learning, we are constantly teaching, and we are constantly bettering ourselves to be able to live this world and to live this life in this world. And while it may be hard, it's a task, and we're up to it. And I think that you all here right now, the 27 of you, not counting myself, the 27 of you are doing the right thing by continuing your education, by coming together and sharing this virtual space, talking to each other and being present with one another. You're learning together. And even if you forget it, you're spending time together. And I think that's probably the most important part right now, is spending time together, which can lead to so many other things. So I thank you all so much for this opportunity. I'm happy to take comments or questions in a moment. Again, this is what I go through every single day. I learn something, and then 20 minutes later, I have no idea what I learned. I wrote a sermon for Shabbat at God knows what time in the morning the other day. I don't remember what I wrote about. All I know is that my mentor rabbi at the shul that I work at, he said it was an excellent piece of Devar Torah. And I said, great, I hope it's good when I read it. I don't remember what I wrote about. And that's my daily struggle, is that I don't remember things. But I come back to them. And I always remember that I can come back to them. Anne says that it's about habit and correcting bad habits. That's yes, 100%. Right? And some of those bad habits, by the way, some of those bad habits can turn into good habits. Right? It's a bad habit that I forget things, but I can come back to them, which can be it's a great habit by itself. Any other comments, questions, thoughts? And then I'll let you all be and enjoy your white Thursday.
Koach, David.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. It was so great. I just truly enjoy learning with you. And
Thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
Hope to see you in person not too far into the future.
God willing.
yeah, wouldn't that be good?
Yes.
Be wonderful.
Anyways, everybody take care, be well, stay safe, stay healthy. For those of you who have your vaccines, mazal tov to you. For those of you who are getting them soon, b'hatzlacha. I hope that it's a meaningful and healthy experience. And most importantly, the most important thing of all.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David.
You're very welcome. Shabbat shalom, everybody. Take care, be well, stay safe.
Thank
Good to be with you all. Take care.
Thanks
Bye.
for taking time.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Take care, everybody.